In this unit, we're discussing environmental stability, or how stable populations can be in different environments, and how the environment can affect populations, and how certain populations like humans can have an effect on the environment as well. So how are populations described? Well, a population is a group of individuals within one species living in a geographic area. So this group of emperor penguins is a population. It's all one species and it's living in this particular area. And ecologists use several terms to describe the health of a population. First, they discuss where it can be found, and we call that the geographic range. So this is the area in which a population can be found all over the world. So this is a population of balsam poplars, trees that are used for construction. This is the range of that balsam poplar species. We also discuss population density. That is the number of individuals of the same species in an area. So if we're discussing our balsam poplars again, we might say there are 50 balsam poplars per acre. If we're discussing people, you might say 100 people per square mile. And this is an example of a population density map where you can see that the darker areas, there are more people per square kilometer. And then in the lighter areas, there are very few individuals or none, because those are deserts. Population growth is how quickly the population size is changing. So according to this map of the human population, which countries have the highest population density? That would be these areas that have the darker regions like Nigeria and Uganda and Egypt, and Morocco. So while we're discussing population growth, here's a question posing to you. Would you rather be paid $5 an hour for a 20-hour week, or a salary that starts at 1 cent the first hour and doubles each hour up to 20 hours? So straight $5 an hour for 20 hours, or 1 cent the first hour and then doubling every hour up to 20. So let's do the math. $5 an hour for 20 hours is 5 times 20, $100. If you do 1 cent doubling every hour, you will end up after 20 hours with $10,485. So just a small difference there. This math includes a very distinct pattern here of linear growth. We are increasing at a very steady rate, a constant rate, up to that 20 hours worked, money is growing at the same rate. So a very steady graph. With our 1 cent doubling every hour, we're starting at 1 hour with 1 cent, then 2 hours at 2 cents, and then 3 hours at 4 cents, just going very, very slowly at the beginning here. And then as you start getting a couple of dollars built up, it increases rapidly, and we call that exponential growth. So populations grow in a similar pattern. This graph shows linear growth, which is a pattern of increase in a constant amount. But this graph shows exponential growth, which is a pattern of increase at a constant rate. For example, doubling was what we used. Times 2 is a constant rate, but it is not increasing at a constant amount like in linear growth. Biological populations grow exponentially. They don't grow with linear growth. Almost all of the time, they are growing in an exponential pattern when they are in an environment that has unlimited resources. When graphed, their population numbers make a J curve. So that's pretty easy to understand why this is called a J curve of exponential growth. But there are factors that change how quickly a population can grow. First, populations are made of individual organisms, each with a particular lifespan. So when we're discussing an individual's life in terms of population size, there are a few terms that ecologists use. Natality is the addition of new individuals to a population, and usually this is through birth. So when new individuals are born, we call that natality. Fecundity is the ability of an organism to reproduce. So how fertile is the organism? How many times a year can it reproduce, or how many times a decade even can it reproduce? Depends on the organism. Fertility is the number of offspring produced. Obviously, some organisms can produce litters of lots of offspring, even if we're talking about mammals here. If we're talking about invertebrates or insects, we might be talking about thousands of individuals produced. Mortality is the death rate. And life expectancy is the predicted length of survival, which is obviously different for lots of different species. So in summary, a population is a group of one species found in a geographic area at a certain time. Depending on lifespan factors, biological populations can grow exponentially, which can be illustrated as a J curve. So even though populations can increase exponentially, they don't increase indefinitely. The environment keeps populations from increasing forever at an exponential rate. These limits are called limiting factors. So limiting factors may cause organisms to die or move out of an area. They are restricting the growth of the population. For example, these red deer are sparring, which occurs when they compete for space or mates. So if there's too big of a population of red deer, the competition may cause some to die or be driven away to a different area. And there are two types of limits that regulate the size of a population. Density-dependent factors have an increasing effect as the population increases. For example, predators, disease, competition, etc. These are usually biotic factors. So usually we're talking about living organisms here. Density dependent, meaning that they have an increasing effect when the population has gotten too large. So for example, if you have a population of rabbits, the larger the population of rabbits, the greater the effect of predators are going to be, because those rabbits are going to be very easy to catch and kill because the population is so large. Same thing with disease. The larger the population is, the easier a disease can spread and therefore wipe out a population, or at least limit the amount of growth that it has. Density-independent factors affect all populations regardless of how large they are. So they are affecting all populations, small and large, at the same rate. For example, a change in temperature, storms, floods, drought, etc. And these are usually abiotic factors, so non-living. These are affecting all populations regardless of how large. So which type of limiting factor is this hurricane? It's going to be a density-independent factor, because it doesn't matter what size of a rabbit population there is. If that hurricane comes through, it is going to eliminate some of the population. It's not affecting larger populations more than smaller. So what is the logistic model of growth? Well, eventually, since we have these limiting factors, the population will stabilize at a point called the carrying capacity. And when we use a graph here, carrying capacity is listed as K, the variable K. And carrying capacity is simply the number of organisms that an environment can support over a long period of time. So not the maximum that it can ever support, but the maximum that it can support for a long period of time. And this type of graph or type of growth is called logistic growth, which forms an S curve. So we start with exponential growth here, and then the growth slows down until we reach that carrying capacity. This would be T for time. This is numbers of individuals. Now, as I mentioned, the carrying capacity is not a total maximum. It is like a population equilibrium. The population is in balance with the environment around it. So, like any equilibrium, the population is not perfectly constant. It still fluctuates around the carrying capacity. So we show exponential growth here, and sometimes then the population can overshoot what that carrying capacity is, and then there will be a die-off, and then some individuals will be able to survive again, and we get that fluctuation. So here we get a population overshoot, and suddenly there's a higher population than the environment can support. Individuals die. Now we've got a lower population than the environment can support, so more of them are able to survive then. So in summary, limiting factors can be density dependent or density independent. These limits cause a population curve to level off at the carrying capacity, creating an S curve. At this point, the population is in equilibrium with its environment. Okay, let's take a closer look at individual organisms and species. We were taking sort of a bird's eye view of populations as a whole. A niche is the unique role that a species plays in the environment. So, for example, if you had a bird, that bird may be a predator. It could be a consumer. It could at some times be prey. It's not going to be a decomposer, but other species would be. And that is a role that this species plays in its environment, but it does have multiple different roles. So different niches exist for the same organism. Factors such as optimum temperature and required resources help to determine a niche. So organisms are only going to be able to live at a certain temperature, and they're going to require certain resources. And so that will help to determine how much their niche is extended throughout the environment. A habitat, on the other hand, is exactly where an organism lives. It can be shared with other species. This includes the food required for that organism to survive, the shelter, and the resources. And so the habitat is simply where it lives. It doesn't have anything to do with the role that it plays, how it interacts with other organisms. This is just where you can find that organism. And a fundamental niche is the role an organism can occupy without competition. So if there were no other predators that it was competing with, let's say, the fundamental niche is the role that it could fill if there were no other competitors and it wasn't competing for any prey or any resources or space. A realized niche is the smaller niche an organism occupies because of competition. So here's an example. Lions and hyenas share resources like space and prey. Without the competition of other species, they would each have a larger niche. So there would be less competition for the hyenas from the lions, and they would be able to expand and eat prey elsewhere. Here, the lions are interacting with those hyenas and competing with them for prey, so they aren't going to be able to occupy the same role. They're not going to be able to expand their population as much because they're competing for prey. Tolerance is the ability of an organism to survive in changing conditions within the niche. So when things change in that typical niche, like there's a lack of prey, there's drought, any of those limiting factors that we mentioned before, each type of organism, each species is going to have a different amount of tolerance for those changing conditions. Some species are known as specialists, and these are organisms that have very limited tolerances and can only withstand small changes in their niche. And then there are also species generalists, which are organisms that adapt easily to changes in their niche due to large ranges of tolerance. So maybe they are able to survive in a large range of temperatures, and so they can migrate or move. Maybe they have a wide range of prey, and so if one species of prey dies out, they can switch to something else. The giant panda only eats bamboo. Do you think it qualifies as a generalist or a specialist? Well, this is going to be a specialist because it doesn't have a lot of options. If the environment changes and bamboo trees start to die, that panda is not going to be in a good situation because it's not going to have other resources that it can rely on. So it is a species specialist. What are the other types of symbiotic relationships? So what are the types of symbiotic relationships? These are special relationships between particular organisms. Organisms not only interact with their surroundings, but also with each other. Of course, you know this. Symbiotic relationships exist when two species live in close contact for some or all of their lives. So this clownfish and sea anemone, obviously they're in close contact, as you can see in the picture. They have a symbiotic relationship. Mutualism is a relationship in which both organisms benefit. So for example, with our anemone and clownfish, the anemone provides the clownfish with protection because the anemone has stinging tentacles, and so it is able to ward off other predators. The clownfish is actually immune to that. And the clownfish provides the anemone nutrients from its waste and scares off potential predators. So this is a beneficial relationship to both organisms, a specific type of symbiotic relationship that we call mutualism. In commensalism, one organism benefits and the other is unaffected, or at least relatively unaffected. For example, tree frogs use plants for protection. To protect themselves, they camouflage and hide in plants. That doesn't affect the plant, but it does allow those tree frogs to survive better. And so they are benefiting, the plants are being unaffected. In parasitism, one organism is harmed and the other benefits. So fleas and ticks are an example of this. They are living off the blood of a host animal. And so that animal, that host animal, is getting less blood. Therefore, its health is being affected, but it is providing a resource to the parasite. So the parasite is benefiting and the host animal is being harmed by that. Same thing with tapeworms. Let's say inside a human, the tapeworm is growing and stealing nutrition from the host organism. What are the other types of organism relationships? So those are the symbiotic relationships. We also discussed predation, in which one organism is harmed and the other one benefits, but this is a short-lived interaction. So we're not talking about individuals that are living in close contact for their whole lives, these are very short interactions. So, for example, owls hunting mice, caterpillars eating leaves. I'm sure you can come up with a million other predation examples. Competition harms both organisms. And so this might be, here are hippos fighting for food, birds competing for nesting spaces. Both organisms are being harmed because they're not able to fulfill a niche that they would fill otherwise. So in summary, organisms have roles in their environments called niches. The tolerance of an organism is its ability to adapt to changes in its niche. Organisms can also interact with each other in relationships that are beneficial, neutral, or harmful. Okay, we'll back up again and look at an overview of ecosystems and environments here using a term called biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of living things in a particular environment. And there are three main types of biodiversity. Genetic diversity, which is the different genes within a species. So if a particular species has a large variety of genes and traits, then it will have high genetic diversity. Species diversity, which is the number of different species in an area. And ecosystem diversity, which is the variety of ecosystems in an area. So different particular environments, abiotic factors causing different ecosystems in a particular area. And these three types of biodiversity influence each other. So if there is high ecosystem diversity, there may be species there that have high genetic diversity because they have a lot of different environments that they need to occupy. And so on, there might be a little bit of a higher species diversity if there's higher ecosystem diversity, and so on. So why is biodiversity important? Why does this term matter? Well, biodiversity helps to keep ecosystems in balance. Ecosystems with higher biodiversity are better able to withstand natural and human-caused impacts to the environment. So if there is a greater biodiversity, then you have more variety in an environment. And more variety allows populations to withstand changes in the environment better because it's unlikely that all of the individuals or all of the ecosystems even would be affected if there are a wide variety included in that environment. And the ability to withstand natural and human-caused impacts is known as an ecosystem's resilience. So how do invasive species affect this biodiversity? An invasive species is one that is artificially introduced into an ecosystem. So maybe it has a particular application for humans, and so humans introduced them, or maybe it came along as a tag-along traveler on ships, or as lumber was moved from one place to another. There's lots of different ways that invasive species can come into a new environment. Not all of them are purposeful. Invasive species can often have rapid population growth because they have few natural limiting factors. Because they are not meant to be in that ecosystem, we're not naturally in that ecosystem for long periods of time, the environment may not have limiting factors that are able to stop that population growth. Predators, for example, may not recognize the new species as prey. They may be able to outcompete natural organisms that are already in that environment. An example of an invasive species is the cane toad. 100 cane toads were introduced to the island of Australia in 1935 to kill a beetle infestation. So this was a purposeful introduction of an invasive species. The cane toad population today is estimated to be around 200 million. It has no natural predators and can be a real nuisance to humans. So this is an example of an invasive species that really took off because it did not have limiting factors. Biodiversity in these ecosystems can be dramatically affected because the invasive species can outcompete the native populations, which then limits the number of species that are able to exist there and then decreases the biodiversity of the whole ecosystem. Another example here is the poisonous lionfish. It is native to the coasts of Africa and Australia, but it was introduced to the coast of Florida when people released them from their home aquariums. They have since spread rapidly through the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. You can see this map shows all of the locations that they have been found. And they are spreading rapidly because they are able to outcompete native fish. So in summary, there are three main types of biodiversity: species, genetic, and ecological. Ecosystems with high biodiversity are more resilient to natural and human-made changes. An ecosystem's biodiversity can be dramatically affected by invasive species. So we've now discussed biodiversity and how it can be beneficial when there are changes to an ecosystem. But let's talk about what changes can actually occur in an ecosystem. Natural biodiversity can be impacted by changes to habitats that are a result of natural disasters, weather, disease, and human interference. If these environmental changes are severe enough, the community can go through stages of succession. And ecological succession is just the process of change within a community over time. So if an environment is so dramatically altered by a flood, a fire, any type of disease, if this environment is completely changed by, let's say, human influence, there can be a long stage of ecological succession where the environment starts to recover or rebound over time, but it's a long process. There are two types of succession: primary and secondary. Primary succession occurs where soil has not previously existed. So this would be on, let's say, glaciers, where glaciers have melted and left till behind, newly exposed rocks, and lava flows. So this would be a very dramatic change to an environment. It begins with pioneer species like lichens that break down the rock to form soil. Grass and moss follow as soil is formed. So lichens, if you're not familiar with them, are a symbiotic, mutualistic relationship between algae and fungi. And they attach to the surface of bare rocks. The fungi help to hold on to the bare rocks, and the algae absorb sunlight to provide nutrients for both organisms. And as they grow, they slowly, over very long periods of time, start to break down the bare rock until soil begins to be formed. And that allows other organisms to then come in and survive. So here's an example or a picture of primary succession. We start with bare rock. There is no soil there. And lichens and pioneer species begin to move in and add to the soil as they use their roots to dig through the bare rock, and also when they die and decompose, and they add to the topsoil. So slowly that soil builds up over time, and then it can support larger and larger organisms until we reach something called a climax community. And this can take hundreds of years. Secondary succession is different. It occurs after an environmental change like a hurricane, a flood, or a fire. It occurs more quickly than primary succession because soil is already in place. So we're not starting with bare rock and pioneer species. The soil is already there. Here's an example of a forest that has experienced a fire, and then secondary succession begins as these small plants start to come in as that soil is still already there, and actually the fire can make some of those nutrients available to plants, and so fire can actually be a great instigator of growth in a forest. Here's an example of secondary succession. Let's say there was a fire, just as we were talking about, and then suddenly all the species are wiped out here, but the soil is still in existence, as you can see. And so it happens more rapidly here, that we get some small plants and shrubs, and they generally get then larger. You get maybe some woody plants in there, and then we get trees until we reach a climax community. So what exactly is a climax community? Well, it was thought to be the final stage of succession because an ecosystem had returned to a level of stability. So this was sort of like the end result. That's what scientists thought. However, ecologists have now noticed that many climax communities are not the same as the original communities that existed before the disturbance. So it's difficult to really call it a climax community because it's not the same as the original community that existed. And that is one of the reasons that environmental impacts can be so long-lasting, especially human impacts, since we can make very large impacts in a very short amount of time. And that population, that community may never quite recover to the same extent that it originally was. In summary, ecological succession is the process of change within an ecosystem. Primary succession occurs in areas that have not been previously occupied. Secondary succession occurs when communities regrow in areas that have experienced a disturbance. So if we can have such a drastic effect on ecosystems for hundreds of years, potentially, by misusing ecosystem resources, it's important to know how to use environmental resources properly. So let's begin with a discussion of how renewable and non-renewable resources differ. Well, renewable resources are naturally replenished over short periods of time. So that would be things like sunlight and fresh water. They're being constantly renewed. Water's being renewed through the water cycle. So sometimes it's a little bit slower than we might like, but it does get recycled. Non-renewable natural resources take a long time to replenish. And that would be things like topsoil and fossil fuels, which could take millions of years to replenish. So to prevent resources from being depleted, they should be used at a sustainable rate, one that replaces what's used. So when we're talking about using resources sustainably, we're saying we are using them at the same rate that they are able to be replenished and recycled. What is an ecological footprint? So although global resource use is important, while we're talking about the entire human population using resources, we also need to consider how much of the resources are used per person. So how many of the resources from your environment are being used by you specifically? Did you know that the average American uses 101.5 gallons of water per day? That is pretty dramatic. That's not something that's going to be able to be recycled in the amount of time that we need it to. We're not using that at a sustainable rate. An ecological footprint is a measure of the demands made by one person or group on global natural resources. So an ecological footprint includes the materials and resources consumed and the resources needed to dispose of the waste produced. Because we're not just discussing the resources that are consumed, for example, timber or water, but we're also talking about the resources necessary to get rid of the waste that's produced by you or a group of individuals. That can also take a toll on the environment. If landfills are required, or if maybe there's biohazardous waste that's being disposed of. So this can be a significant portion of the amount of the environment that we are affecting. This map shows the comparison of ecological footprints for each country. As you might expect, developed countries use a lot more resources. They have larger ecological footprints than the less developed countries. So the United States here, some of Europe. Europe is generally better than the United States at being sustainable and using resources wisely. And so they have slightly smaller ecological footprints often. Although ecological footprints are generally used to refer to humans, all organisms have some ecological footprint. So what is sustainability? We've talked about it very slightly here. But sustainability is pursuing global development in ways that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So using what we need in the present from the environment to develop cities and survive and have electricity and use water without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same. What happens if we don't use resources sustainably? Well, impacts of excessive consumption of resources include climate change, as well as declining ecosystem health and biodiversity. And pollution, of course, can be a consequence of excessive consumption that we need to be careful about. So in summary, your ecological footprint includes the renewable and non-renewable resources used and waste produced. Reducing our global ecological footprint by living sustainably will allow resources to be available for future generations.